Thank you guys so much for coming out today. Great speakers that I have to follow, unfortunately, and we have a great lineup after lunch as well. But my name is Paloma Lehfeldt. I'm a physician and the Senior Director of Clinical Science and Partnerships at Goodness Growth Holdings. Flew in from DC a few nights ago, and I think I've told a lot of you that this is my favorite airport in the country. Also, my favorite musician was born here, the artist formerly known as Prince. So always thrilled to be here. My background prior to going to medical school, my master's is in biological psychology. So I did a lot of research on addiction medicine and the biological basis of addiction. Prior to going to medical school, I've acquired a lot of student loans in my days, but I never received any formal training about cannabis. So I've always kind of supplemented my education learning about cannabis as I do my multitasking. Let's see what we got here. Can you guys see my screen? Nope, kind of. Okay. So let's jump into it. So kind of as I was, learning about cannabis throughout my education, what happened? There. I think things are just popping up, but bear with me. Apologies for that. As I was learning about cannabis science, it was always kind of like, why isn't cannabis part of this education? I went to, some relatively good schools and we just never were taught about any kind of plant medicine. And it's really unfortunate because, as I was, seeing research participants and patients in clinic, more and more I was seeing people really abusing these single agent pharmaceuticals that we see all the time, ranging from SSRIs to benzos to opiates, which we're all very well familiar with, the opioid epidemic, and just really seeing it be a detriment to patients. So I really became interested in why. And so we're going to go in a time machine. We're going to go back to ancient China, ancient Egypt, and really learn about the history of medical cannabis, this plant that we've co-evolved with for thousands and thousands of years, and really has been an integral part of medicine throughout our existence on this planet. So the first documented use of medical cannabis was in 2700 BC. His name's Emperor Shen Nung. There's some differentiating literature about Shen Nung, but he really was the founder of documenting herbal medicine. He called cannabis plant Ma, which sounds very similar to marijuana, of course, and was really interested in studying the female and male portions of the plant. So this is the first time that we really see it documented. Going forward in time a little bit, this is the Ebers papyrus. It's one of the first papyri that was really documenting herbal medicine as well. It was used, they had in this papyrus to put it directly onto the skin for inflammation, sounding a little familiar to some of the topicals that we see today. Another cool fact is that on Ramses II's sarcophagus, they found cannabis pollen residue. So again, this has been used for thousands and thousands of years. Jumping back to ancient China, but 200 AD, we're going to see a surgeon, Hua Tuo, who was reducing cannabis to a powder and mixing it with wine to use as an anesthetic. Not for just minor surgeries. We're not talking about stitches. We're talking about thoracotomies, which are opening of the chest wall. He's using cannabis as an anesthetic, which is, a lot better than nothing. But again, it's pretty intense. But again, the medicinal properties of cannabis continue to be well documented throughout history. So those are kind of some of my favorite ancient history, but we're going to jump way ahead now to the United States. So when we start, Jamestown settlers come, cannabis was really used as a major export in the United States. It was on the sail ships that we use. We used hemp for our clothes. And George Washington actually grew hemp in Mount Vernon. And he was really interested, actually, his diary entries were showing that he was really interested in formulating high THC cannabis. Also very interested in the difference between the male and female plant. The female plant is the plant that makes the medicine. The female does all the work. But he was very interested in that as well. And again, just such an integral part of our economy in United States for such a long time prior to where we're going to go after this, 2 presidents later, Thomas Jefferson was also documented to grow cannabis in Monticello. So again, before the stigma was really present, cannabis was a huge part of the American economy. So this is non-medicinal. This is kind of just using the whole plant as we do today sometimes. The first time that we really see cannabis in the Western world medicinally, this is Dr. William O'Shaughnessy. He was studying at medicine in Calcutta in India. He was very interested in how cannabis was working medicinally. This guy is brilliant. He also, drew up a electric motor document at the same time that it was invented. Very interested in IV medicine, but again, he brought it over to Europe and was very interested in its medicinal properties. He used it to cure epilepsy. He was using it in pediatric patients. We know that works well today, cannabidiol specifically, and was very interested in its analgesic or pain relieving effects as well. So many of the conditions that we see today have been brought over, in 1841 by this physician. This is one of my little factoids, since women's health is such an important issue with regard to cannabis, but Queen Victoria, her physician, was known to use cannabis, not documented, but there are a lot of rumors that he used it on Queen Victoria as well for menstrual cramps and different women's health issues. So this is a great, fact as well. Cannabis today has been shown to be a great relief for uterine fibroids, menstrual cramps, sexual health. So again, this was a very ahead of its time, but not really. We were kind of on this trajectory to really use cannabis medicinally before we kind of see the downfall, which we'll again speak to. Jumping back to the United States, this is the 3rd edition of the U.S. Pharmacopoeia. The USP is still very much in use and respected today. They come out every year with kind of a list of all herbal medicines and single agent pharmaceuticals that are used to treat a variety of conditions. It's kind of the Bible for pharmacists and physicians and healthcare providers to really see what medicine is really best for their patients. So the 3rd edition is the first time that we see medical cannabis. So in the United States, we're really starting to use cannabis as a medicine. I love these old-timey pictures, Apothecarium, but it was used in tincture form. And it was one of the most top 3 prescribed medicines from 1842. So that's just amazing. And it was indicated from anything ranging from many of the qualifying conditions that we see today, right? Chronic pain, I think they listed leprosy, which, is not something that we thankfully have to worry about today. But opiate addiction, again, was one of the indications that it was listed as well. So it was really, destigmatized. It was really available in most Americans' medicine cabinets in the same way that we reach for a bottle of aspirin. There was a cannabis tincture there as well. So that was kind of the height of cannabis medicinally in the United States. And what we start to see is the beginning of the so-called war on drugs, which resulted in the federal illegalization of cannabis. So in 1910, we see the Mexican Revolution, which is really the first time in the United States that we're seeing the recreational use of cannabis. And unfortunately, this came with a lot of stigma and xenophobic sentiments as well. This is why you will very rarely hear me use the word marijuana, because it was associated with the Mexican immigrants in a derogatory way to kind of stigmatize this plant that, again, was so prevalent in American culture and a plant that we've co-evolved with. But unfortunately, they were really using the plant to instill fear with this new onslaught of immigrants in the United States. This continued as in the United States with Reefer Madness. Unfortunately, propaganda is very powerful and it works. Fear-mongering tactics. The crazy reefer was really, again, propagated, and in churches, these videos were played all the time. If you YouTube these videos, I mean, they're very ridiculous, but they did their job, unfortunately, and continued to stigmatize this plant that, again, has been around for so long. Following that, and around the same time, we have the formation of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, with this deplorable individual known as Harry J. Anslinger. He he was very open and said very incredibly racist remarks about black and brown Americans, associated them with cannabis. I never repeat what he says, but unfortunately, what he said stuck. And he created in 1937, he created the marijuana tax law, which successfully criminalized cannabis in the United States. And on the very first day that the tax law was enacted, we had the first arrest of cannabis. And this is Samuel R. Caldwell. There were other individuals who were arrested the same day. He was thrown in jail for growing cannabis and unfortunately died about a year later. This is 1937. Again, this is a very important year in history. And one of our brands that it's our diversity, equity, and inclusion brand that we really bring light to stand on the right side of history, because after this, unfortunately, it's a complete downfall, and we're still feeling the after effects very much so today. Following this, the Marijuana Tax Act, we have the Boggs Act of 1951, which had mandatory sentence for drug convictions of all kinds. So we're starting to really see an uptick in incarceration based on cannabis. There was a minimum sentence of cannabis possession for 2 to 10 years and a fine of up to $20,000, which was a very significant portion of money now and back then. So this is all kind of the dark side of history in the United States. But when this is all going on in Israel at Hebrew University, THC is being synthesized and discovered. This was the paper. This is Dr. Raphael Meshulam, who's still alive and lecturing today at Hebrew University. Brilliant man, has wonderful work. But this is actually part of his paper, Discovering THC, which is, again, love the old-timey stuff. Isolation, structure, and partial synthesis of an active constituent of hashish, our major cannabinoid, tetrahydrocannabinol, which was discovered then. So while all of this is kind of the dark ages of cannabis that are going on in the United States, molecular biologists and chemists are very excited because they have this new molecule. They really believe that it was kind of this false steroid at the beginning because it has a very similar structure to our to cortisol, but it's lipophilic that we were talking about. But like cortisol, it produces kind of these orexigenic, anti-inflammatory effects. So scientists were very interested in its structure, and this was going on at the same time that we're going back to the United States, where Nixon is here further propagating the war that he really, names it, the war on drugs. You'll hear me call it the so-called war on drugs over and over again because it was a systematic targeting of specific communities in the United States, not so much on the plant. The plant was really more of a figurehead, unfortunately, and again, still remains so today. With the Nixon legislation, he created the Controlled Substance Act, which we'll speak about further as well, and what that means, as well as just establish the Drug Enforcement Agency. So this is the Controlled Substance Act, which schedules different drugs based on their ability to, their efficaciousness, how they do harm, but basically ranging from Schedule 1, meaning it has no medicinal value whatsoever, to Schedule 5 being relatively benign with minimal side effects to achieve patient success. So cannabis was scheduled as a Schedule 1 drug. And this means that it has no medicinal effects, even though, as we just saw from the history, it has a well-documented history of amazing medicinal effects since, 2700 BC. But it's sitting up there today, which we'll talk about a little bit, the federal legalization a little bit later today. But it sits up there today with really detrimental and incredibly lethal drugs, including heroin and methamphetamines. And just, I also want to make a point that our oral opiates are actually listed as Schedule 2. Speaking of scheduling, in around 1980, Marinol, the FDA actually synthesized, I believe it was approved a few years later. This is synthetic THC. It's dronabinol is the name that the doctors and pharmacists use, but it was used and approved by the FDA for chemotherapy-related nausea and vomiting. So at the same time that we're scheduling this drug as a Schedule 1 drug, we're synthesizing its active constituent to use clinically for medicinal purposes. And it was scheduled initially as a Schedule 2. We'll talk about that a little bit. But again, that active constituent of THC was there. So the FDA is aware of its medicinal effects, synthesizing it as so. And the issue with Marinol, though, doctors hate to prescribe it because it's just that THC. I think a lot of us know about the entourage effect and how important those other cannabinoids are to mitigate those side effects. But doctors very rarely prescribe Marinol because it's just that one plant component. I'm going back happy and sad. So while that's happening, preclinical research is amazing, but this is when we're starting to really see aspects of my favorite organ system, the endocannabinoid system, being discovered. This was at University of Missouri, St. Louis in Missouri, that the CB1 receptor, cannabinoid receptor 1, was discovered in the rat brain. And this is kind of, so exciting that we have our own endocannabinoid system. The endocannabinoid system receptor, CB1, is present in all mammalian bodies. It's not in the insect, but it is, this target that really could be utilized from a pharmacological standpoint. This is the G protein coupled receptor. It looks like a squiggly snake. It's, you don't have to know that, but what's important is that it's one of the receptors that all pharmaceutical agents, about half of them, are targeting. And cannabinoid receptor 1 is also a G protein coupled receptor. So I'll say this again. I really like to call the endocannabinoid system this pharmacological treasure trove that we're not utilizing because it has this propensity to really be able to be used, as we know just anecdotally, that it's used for so many different conditions. So 1988, it was discovered. And CB1 receptors, it's a gross oversimplification to say that CB1 is just in the central nervous system and CB2 is in the immune system. They're both present throughout the body, but CB1 and CB2 work in conjunction with our own endogenous cannabinoids, our internal cannabinoids, as well as exogenous, or the plant medicine that's utilized in our program. Back to the bad news. 1988, this is when we see the Just Say No, DARE. I think, someone was speaking about that. Were you speaking about that? DARE? Someone was speaking. Brittany was speaking about DARE. Yes, this is more of the same. Non-violent, we call them non-violent or victimless drug offenses increased from 50,000 in 1980 to over 400,000 by 1997. These are people that don't have victims. These are people that are just, it can be anything. We do expungement clinics at Goodness Growth Holdings. People have 2 charges for 20 years for having a roach in their car. They'll have it for possession and for paraphernalia. So this is, again, something that's being propagated still today. Going back to the good news. So this is anandamide. This is my favorite endocannabinoid. Our endocannabinoids are our own internal ligands that bind to our receptors and produce different effects. Ananda is literally the Sanskrit word for bliss. So this is the bliss molecule that our body is creating, which is so amazing. And it's responsible for that feeling that you get from the runner's high. So when you feel that response and you have that, that's because of anandamide. That's an endocannabinoid our body makes. It comes from the arachidonic acid pathway that I won't hurt my fellow healthcare providers reminding them of. But anandamide is just a wonderful endocannabinoid. We'll talk a little bit about endocannabinoid deficiency and what that means as well. And then the second most famous endocannabinoid, 2-AG or 2-arachidonyl glycerol, was founded in 1995, a few years later. That is actually elevated, has been shown to be elevated in the female orgasm. So both of these are very blissful molecules that were discovered, in the early 90s. Moving back to the bad news, or not so bad news, this is very interesting. During this time when all of this is being studied, Marinol, again, the drug I brought up earlier, the single agent pharmaceutical of synthetic THC, is now being rescheduled from Schedule 2 to Schedule 3. So just something to keep in mind while cannabis remains Schedule 1 today. In 2001, retrograde signaling is discovered. So this is, again, another amazing pharmacological treasure trove that we never had really heard of before. So why I wanted to have this slide, because I wanted to use the pointer. So in regular neurotransmission, what happens is that you go from this neuron to this neuron. It's basically like when you're playing telephone at school, you're telling this neuron is telling this neuron a secret. These are the neurotransmitters or the endocannabinoids that are relayed from point A to point B. And this is canonical. This is how we always understand neurotransmission. What's so cool is that this was discovered, again, 20 years ago, is that in the endocannabinoid system, we go from this neuron to relay the message. So it goes backwards. So think about, again, pharmacological treasure trove, how cool that is. When we're used to having all these guys fire from the blue to the red, we have this other complete system that can go this way to this way and kind of slow down that firing. And that's an oversimplification of kind of what's happening in epilepsy, but you can see it right here. And the difference is that the receptors of the cannabinoid receptor, this is the squiggly line from earlier, are on this presynaptic or first neuron that they bind to from this postsynaptic neuron. So again, super cool that this is being discovered around this time and that we have this whole other system and mechanism to really be using for different disease states. In 2001, Canada adopts federal legalization, again, over 20 years ago. And in 2004, clinical endocannabinoid deficiency is first hypothesized by Dr. Ethan Russo. He had a great New York Times article about 2 years ago. If you haven't read about clinical endocannabinoid deficiency, it's an amazing theory, and it's been studied and researched a lot, not observational research, which is still incredibly important. But a lot of these disease states, fibromyalgia, migraine, or IBS, which are really rampant, are kind of these diagnoses of exclusion. We call them that because we don't have a diagnostic criteria. We kind of go to them when patients have this, variety of symptoms, and there's no real biological basis. So Dr. Russo hypothesized in 2004 that this was based on this clinical endocannabinoid deficiency. Of course, we're not able to prove it because of the lack of clinical research in order to do so, but these are real patients that we see all the time that are really benefiting from cannabis. This is kind of the same way that you think about, when you have low thyroid levels in your body, you go and get exogenous thyroid hormone. In the same way, when you have low endocannabinoids in the body, you go get exogenous cannabinoids, or that cannabis-based medicine, plant medicine that you see. It's the exact same kind of theory. It's just, we don't have that medical training and education to really support this. And this kind of brings us to where we are now, the opioid epidemic. People that are 65 and over, about a third of them suffer from chronic pain. Opiates are absolutely necessary for particular patient populations, but they're completely overprescribed. We have about 113 people in the United States that are dying every day from opioid overdose. And what's amazing about cannabis that we discussed earlier is that it works in synergy with our opioids. It's called synergistic analgesia. So you need a lesser dose of your opiates in order to achieve pain relief. So this is, again, and I think Dr. Lockitz was talking about adjuvant therapy is really why we need to have this in our toolkit, because chronic pain is not going anywhere. And unfortunately, I could talk about mental health as well, but either are mental health issues. We're seeing a horrible uptick in them right now, post-pandemic. Again, third of our population. And, opioids are really the tip of the iceberg. When you're in pain, you don't just go for 1 or 2 Advil. You're going to pop them like candy, and they're completely detrimental to the aging kidneys, the aging heart. Acetaminophen is horrible for the aging liver. And again, we have something that's, obviously comes with side effect profile, but can really be more benign comparatively to a lot of these single agent pharmaceuticals, especially opiates. And that's why a lot of the research that we're doing, we have a $3.8 million NIH grant. This is, we just started getting the results now for decrease in opioid usage in medical cannabis patients in New York with the Albert Einstein College of Medicine. Again, I think we can all agree here that more research is really needed. And unfortunately, it looks like we were on that trajectory before the so-called war on drugs, which is why it's so important to really know about the history of cannabis. I love this slide. The end.